It's a webinar on conservation finance, a webinar that is hosted by the Africa CSO Biodiversity Alliance, to whom I chair the policy working group, and in that capacity, I will be hosting the event. We are jointly convening the event together with Africa Development Bank. And as we wait for the rest of the people to join in, I would like to share the agenda. So we have, I'm excited to be hosting you this evening, and I have a lineup of very distinguished experts that we are going to have dialogue with. This is mainly a dialogue between civil society in Africa and basically where the money comes from, the GEF, UNEP, Africa Development Bank. We also have a representative from one of the national governments. And to start the meeting, I would first and foremost would like to let you know that we have translation. And if you would like for you to benefit from this, you would have to click on the button in translation and select the language that you would like to use. We have both French and English. So we will have opening remarks from Dr. Anthony Nyong, followed by Kadu Sebunya. Kadu Sebunya is Executive Officer from the Africa Wildlife Foundation, and the Africa Wildlife Foundation is the host institution for the Africa CSO Biodiversity Alliance. Immediately after the keynote, the opening remarks, we will have a keynote presentation from the Global Environment Facility, which will kickstart the discussion. And I have a panel that I will introduce just before the presentation, just before their discussion. We are hoping to have this webinar concluded by 6 p.m. And if time allows, we will have a Q&A session, having the questions that you will be submitting as we move along. Some of you have already submitted questions that we have discussed. So at this point in time, I would like to introduce, first and foremost, I would like the participants to use the chat room to introduce themselves, greet the rest of the participants and mention where you're coming from and your names, but also use the Q&A to submit questions to the panelists or even to the keynote presenter. So I would like to invite Dr. Anthony.
Yes. Okay, thank you so very much. Do I have the floor? Thank you so very much, moderator. It's a privilege to be at this meeting, particularly recognizing the members of the panel, the panelists, very committed and dedicated people. And my special regards to Carlos of the GEF, whom we haven't met yet, but it's one of the bank's strongest development partners, helping the African continent to achieve most of its environmental and climate change goals. So thank you so very much, Carlos, and we look forward to meeting with you. And distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Vice President, Kevin Kariki, who is not here today because of unavoidable conflicts, it's my privilege to deliver these opening remarks at this webinar on financing biodiversity in Africa from all sources, jointly organized by us and the Africa CSO Biodiversity Alliance. The COVID-19 pandemic took everyone unawares and has brought into question our relationship with nature, and as governments and communities are exploring what a green recovery to the pandemic could look like, building resilience at scale and at all levels and in all sectors is becoming extremely very crucial. Several global reports have consistently shown the extraordinary richness in Africa's biodiversity and ecosystem, which holds huge potentials for the continent's development. However, the continent is experiencing an unprecedented decline in biodiversity, estimated at about 40% decline in 40 years. This is unsustainable. This is unacceptable. The Global Assessment Report of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services sends an unambiguous message saying nature and its vital contributions to people, which together embody biodiversity and ecosystem functions and services, are deteriorating worldwide. Direct and indirect drivers of change have accelerated during the past 50 years. Any attempt to address poverty in Africa must incorporate measures to protect the ecosystem, as both are two sides of the same coin. It is estimated that without income from natural resources, poverty among smallholder farmers in Africa would be 10%, 16% higher, I beg your pardon. As the negotiations to develop the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework are underway, I would like us to reflect on the challenges which have hampered the full realization of previous initiatives and how to ameliorate these challenges going forward. In Africa, these challenges include the limited financial resources, limited stakeholder involvement, and limited integration of biodiversity issues into national development plans and strategies. Despite these challenges, I am hopeful that it is not too late to reverse the declining biodiversity trends, especially in Africa. This calls for a whole of society approach that can transform the way we operate, requiring a fundamental transformation across three socioeconomic systems, namely food, land, and ocean use, along with stronger engagement by sectors driving biodiversity loss, such as agriculture, forestry, fisheries, infrastructure, mining, and extractive industries, as well as the financial sector. Africa needs more innovative, transformative finance in order to deliver tangible, positive impacts regarding our biodiversity conservation. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, to date, progress in implementing the global agenda on biodiversity and ecosystem restoration remains insufficient. Multilateral development banks, like the African Development Bank, and other development financing institutions have a strong role to play by aligning their finances and investment decisions with global, regional, and national agendas on biodiversity conservation. The African Development Bank is committed to Africa's biodiversity agenda, supporting African countries to deliver their ecosystems and natural capital. The bank is investing in several initiatives that support a greener continent through our actions in the very iconic Sahel, the Horn of Africa, the river and forest basins of Chad, Niger, Congo, and in other critical ecosystems. The bank is scaling up finance for climate change that also includes the provision of nature-based solutions through biodiversity conservation. For instance, in 2019, the bank's investments in climate change grew from 9% in 2016 to 35% in 2019, with a commitment to cumulatively mobilize about $25 billion by between 2020 and 2025. The bank has made a direct investment of about $379 million on nature-based projects alone. Public finance, we all know, is insufficient to address Africa's biodiversity needs. The private sector has a critical role to play. However, unlocking private sector investments in biodiversity conservation requires business models for nature-based solutions that are attractive to the private capital, capable of yielding good returns on investment. We need to mobilize substantial resources from innovative sources. We need to explore how existing funding instruments, such as the Global Environment Facility, the Green Climate Fund, the Land Degradation Neutrality Fund, and other environmental financing instruments can leverage resources at scale. We need to cultivate stronger partnerships with businesses, banks, and non-governmental organizations to innovate and transition to nature-positive practices with the full and effective participation of civil society. Let me conclude with a proposal for the establishment of a Rio Conventions Fund that we are exploring at the African Development Bank. The Rio Conventions Fund will promote an integrated, coherent, and multidisciplinary approach to addressing global environmental issues among the three Rio Conventions, namely the Convention on Biodiversity, the Convention to Combat Desertification, and the Framework Convention on Climate Change. Evidence has shown that climate change, biodiversity loss, and land degradation challenges need to be addressed in an integrated and coordinated way in order to speed up implementation and make it more effective. So our belief is that the Rio Conventions Fund, when established, will specifically support the development and preparation of large-scale, financially viable projects and programs on common issues that contribute to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in an integrated manner. Again, we will call on partners, development partners, our financing partners, to come together and let's make this fund a reality. I look forward to a very fulfilling meeting, and I thank you for your kind attention. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anthony Nyong. And I would like to invite Dr. Kadu Sebunya to make his remarks.
Thank you, Pauline. Good evening, and thanks, Dr. Nyongo, for the wonderful opening remarks, and congratulations for the conversion fund that the bank is engineering. We are so thankful for the leadership there. I thank the organizers and the panelists, but also I send our congratulations and greetings to Carlos at GEF from WWF. This is the first time we are interacting with you, but we've known you for a long time, and we look forward to working with you and the GEF. I would like to start by saying special thanks to the Africa CSO Biodiversity Alliance, which we host at AWF. We are so fortunate and to witness this kind of alliances that Africa for so long has missed out, especially in this conservation sector, where we look forward to seeing the African voice, the representation of African perspective, the capacity of Africa that has been so much missing in the way conservation is strategized, conservation is implemented, and conservation is approached on the continent. We're excited about the alliance. I know you are punching above your weight, but congratulations to where you are today. In making my remarks, I have thought long and heard about the challenges Africa is facing with its natural resources. I thought about what is important right now and what kind of building blocks Africa needs to chart a different trajectory from that which other regions have taken. But what does this mean to conservation? Let me start by appreciating the development going on in Africa. Since The Economist magazine, the news magazine, regrettably labeled Africa the hopeless continent 2 decades ago, a profound change has taken hold on our continent. Africa is moving. The decision we are making now for the development trajectory will determine the Africa we shall have and leave to the future generation. The problem is that we are running desperately out of time for Africa, and we must resolve to make the right call for our sakes and for those of the generations to come. Globally speaking, we are, as Africans today, the first generation to witness the Africa, that is the Africa before COVID-19, where economic growth is averaging 4% and more in most countries, foreign investments tripling in many cases. The Africa that is peaceful and elects its leaders compared to less than 5 countries in 1980s. Labor productivity has been rising. Trade between Africa and the rest of the world has increased over 200% since 2000. This is a huge opportunity for our generation to be able to support ending poverty. And perhaps we are the last generation that can take steps to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. For Africa, it's predicted that we will suffer more due to climate change impact. But what is involved with Africa transformation? Some have termed this Africa economic surge as the lion economies, analogies to the Asian tigers. However, as Africa has developed, it's less widely reported or acknowledged that during the same period of economic growth, Africa has experienced devastating losses of its unique wildlife and wildlife heritage. This is happening against the backdrop where 17% of the world's 7.6 billion people already live in Africa today. And by the close of this century, perhaps half of all young people on the planet under the age of 18 will likely be Africans. So, finding land to grow food for this population, building homes for them, constructing roads and railways to transport and fuel to cook food will be already and is already putting unbearable pressure on the land and the water resources. These realities, therefore, challenge conservation, in particular, pose threats to wildlife and wildland conservation as competition increases between people and wildlife for food and space. The research for ways to safeguard Africa's environmental future in sustainable ways is more urgent than before. It is therefore pertinent to consider what Africa's economic development means for its ecological systems. The decisions, therefore, that governments make around population growth, investment, and urbanization might as well shape Africa. And that is how we recycle our waste, how we use water, our choices of sources of energy, our consumption of food, and what type of food will determine the future space left for wild lands and wildlife. Africa and AWF and other conservation agencies have been working on modules in recognition that conservation and development are often inherently compatible and have intersecting and mutually supporting goals. How best to support and amplify these efforts has become one of the most urgent and challenging tasks of our times. We need an understanding that there is no single, simple answer, and that the problems surrounding wildlife and wildlands management are inseparably linked to the complex, diverse, extremely dynamic, and multiple sectoral issues underlying Africa's broader crisis of population, food, poverty, land management, and natural resource management. At African Wildlife Foundation, we hope to change the debate, proposing that African governments do not have to choose conservation over development or development over conservation. None will succeed. Conservationists are not going to succeed if there's no development. And we know development will not succeed without conservation. It's a false choice. The correct question is how to embrace the future and create an Africa that makes wildlife and wildlands a centerpiece of sustainable development, recognizing its unique and inherent value. I'm glad that this conference comes on the heels of the Finance in Common Summit that took place in November 2020. This gives us a better chance to further deliberate on how best to orient investments towards sustainable development and more specifically, conservation. Our unique generational position today challenges us to lead or support the discussion with Africa and define the place and role of wildlife and wildlands in the continent's economic development vision 2063. If we cannot find a balance between nature and economic development, humans will suffer most. Conserving wildlife is key, but not for tourism. But wildlife numbers are the key measurable indicators of our ability as humans to find this balance. Our mistake has often been viewing natural resource management exclusively as an environmental concern. We need to acknowledge that nature degradation is often a symptom of deeper underlying forces involving politics, social, health, and economic dynamics tied to development and broader partners of land use management. The battle for Africa's conservation is not so much, therefore, about lost ecosystems or wildlife. Rather, it's one about our ability as humans to live into the next century. I'm persuaded that there is a better way. And today, this panel might find other ideas. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you for the deliberations.
Thank you very much, both Kadu and Anthony. Those have been very reassuring statements. The launch, particularly the launch of the Rio Convention Fund, and also the uplifting remarks and comments that you've spoken, especially about the Africa CSO Biodiversity Alliance, to which I'm privileged to chair the policy working group. This is a group of CSOs in Africa that was brought together in February this year out of a need for us as CSOs in Africa to effectively engage with the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. We have a mission. Our mission is that Africa's biodiversity thrives and underpins equitable, socially and economically resilient livelihoods based on the rights of the African people to sustainably use their natural resources. We have a number of working groups, 3 of them, the Secretariat that is hosted by AWF. We have the Policy Working Group that I chair, and we also have the Communications Working Group. We have put together a number of engagements, and in this particular engagement, as the CSOs in Africa, we are concerned about financing. We have so many initiatives, we have so many challenges, but we also have so many ideas. But most of the times, these ideas never see the light of day because we need financing to bring them to fruition. So this afternoon, we decided to engage with where the financing comes from so that we can have assurance that our participation in the GBF will be made possible by having some questions on where the financing is coming from. I have a very exciting panel, a panel of experts that we are going to hear from today. And let me just introduce the panel. It will be, first and foremost, apologies from Dr. has said they are looking forward to hearing from him. Due to unavoidable circumstances, he sent in some an apology, but he has given us a representative. He has given us a representative in the names of Muhammad Bakar, who is a senior environmental specialist from the GF. You can see from his smile that he's going to, he's ready to engage with us. He's a very pleasant person. I met him a few minutes ago. He's the lead environmental specialist at the Global Environmental Facility at the Secretariat located in Washington, DC. He's responsible for overseeing all major GF programs designed to advance holistic and integrated solutions to global environmental challenges. And he knows us as CSOs. He has worked with a number of them, including Conservation International, Center for Applied Biodiversity Science, as well as ICRAF. So over to you, Dr. Bakar. I'll stop sharing my screen if I can find the button, and give you the floor to share.
Thank you very much, Pauline. It's a real pleasure to participate in this very important webinar. And as you rightly said, our CEO, Carlos Manuel, sends his regrets. He loves to participate in this kind of event, having spent most of his career also working in the civil society, and he's familiar with most of you. But due to unavoidable circumstances, he could not join. And so while I cannot replace him, I'm actually very delighted to have been given this opportunity. And the two keynotes that we just heard from my very esteemed colleagues that I hold in high respect on the continent have already spoken and really shed light on many of the critical issues facing the continent. So what I will focus on is just to share a little bit of our side of the equation as financial mechanism for the global environment and what role we are playing to help mobilize resources across the African continent, and maybe highlight more specifically some of the models that we might be considering as we move into the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And then I look forward to interaction with the panel and have more constructive discussion. So as we have all heard from our colleagues, Africa, as we know, is at crossroads. The environmental challenges facing the continent are complex, and they require boldness to tackle them efficiently. The COVID-19 pandemic and its unfolding consequences are indeed a stark reminder of what happens when human and natural systems are out of balance. Pandemic has also underscored the importance of strengthening the nexus between public health, pollution abatement, climate action, biodiversity and ecosystems, social equity, and economic prosperity. And of course, we know prior to the pandemic, while many countries were experiencing major economic growth driven by market and investment opportunities, the African continent was faced with the pressures of a rapidly growing population, food insecurity, depletion of natural resources, in particular forests and fisheries, sprawling cities with overstretched infrastructures, and indeed effects of climate change. Hence, not only is the challenge of transformation most acute in Africa, but we must also start the journey still facing basic development needs. So the future Africa wants is actually one that critically hinges on how we best use the continent's natural assets and rich ecosystems, the full potential of which are yet to be tapped. The recent IP-based report provides invaluable scenarios and options for the way ahead. Importantly, the report was clear that the major driver of biodiversity loss in Africa is conversion of natural habitats into agriculture and human settlements, which will worsen the situation if left unchecked. This is consistent with the assessment of progress toward meeting the Aichi biodiversity targets. So while we are on track to achieve protected areas for terrestrial and inland water areas, we are losing badly in arresting economic forces of change, from agriculture, food and land use, to energy and urban systems. With this sobering data, it is time to recognize that the current approach is not good enough to safeguard biodiversity. We must do more directly and comprehensively to address the drivers of biodiversity loss. We must do this recognizing how to build our relationship with the Earth's system. This week, as we are in this webinar, the 8th special session of the African Ministerial Conference is being held virtually, of course, to discuss priorities for the COP15 of the Convention on Biological Diversity to be held in Kunming, China in 2021. The session is also focusing on post-COVID recovery and specifically on how to harness the unprecedented opportunity to reset the global economy on a pathway towards more environmentally sustainable and low carbon and inclusive developmental trajectory. In this context, Africa's economic recovery strategies will need to be aligned to the United Nations 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development and the Sustainable Development Goals, the Africa Union's Agenda 2063, the multilateral environmental agreements, and specifically the Rio Conventions. The AMCEN is therefore considering an African Green Stimulus Program, which is designed, I quote, to respond with urgency to support key sectors in Africa hardest hit by the pandemic, such as ecotourism and the biodiversity economy, close quotes. So as we look ahead to the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, countries must also focus on bringing diverse sectors, including agriculture, mining, and manufacturing into a coordinated action plan. This is key to trigger systems change. Furthermore, in reconciling these opportunities and challenges, governments must balance the urgency of delivering short-term solutions with the need to ensure long-term sustainability and resilience of the systems that underpin economic growth and development. This is at the heart of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Africa Union Agenda 2063. More than ever, there is now a well-established understanding that development in any form cannot happen without a healthy and resilient environment. So our leaders must be bold to ensure that the environment agenda underpins national development and economic growth. Let's take the agriculture and food systems, for example, which is a top priority for all African countries and an area the GEF has been targeting for advancing transformational change. While there's a growing push to transform food production with increased inputs, improved seeds and markets at the forefront, the systems will not be sustainable and resilient if the natural capital, i.e. the land, the soil, and the biodiversity is not managed efficiently. This requires a strong engagement with the agriculture ministries, the agribusiness community, and indeed the farmers. Similarly, as city mayors and municipal governments are grappling with demands for improving road and transport infrastructure, housing and waste management in urban areas, sustainability and resilience can only be assured if urban planning and implementation integrates the environment as a priority. This can only be assured through a partnership between local and national governments, including the Environment Ministry. As you're all aware, the GEF has been bold in taking steps to invest in innovative projects that deliver multiple benefits for people and the global environment. As a strategic partner for environmental financing, we have helped countries to launch several major initiatives to transform how environment and development are integrated across the African continent. An important one to highlight, which Dr. Nyong from the African Development Bank also mentioned, is the Africa Union's Great Green Wall Initiative in the Sahel region. The GEF, in response to demands of countries in the Sahel region, has invested over $500 million in grants and catalyzed an additional $3 billion from national governments, development partners, and other multilateral sources in support of the Great Green Wall Initiative. This financing has helped the countries to increasingly promote innovative practices for improving crop and livestock productivity, while at the same time restoring the degraded parklands and protecting biodiversity. Because of the scale and magnitude of challenges facing the region, much remains to be done for the countries to realize their collective vision of a sustainable, resilient, and prosperous Sahel. Countries are actually demonstrating political will through commitment under the major multilateral environmental agreements, specifically the UNFCCC Paris Agreement, the UNCCD, and the Convention on Biological Diversity. In addition, they are also committed to delivering the Sustainable Development Goals, the Bond Challenge, the Africa 100, and many more commitments at the global level, at the global and regional level. But progress and achievements over the last decade can only be consolidated and scaled up if there is strong support and engagement by development partners, IFIs, international financial institutions, the private sector, and a good buy-in from local stakeholders. Financial needs for achieving impactful outcomes at scale has been estimated by the World Bank to average between $40 to $130 million per country annually. This level of financing will need to be mobilized from diverse sources, both domestically in the countries and internationally by partners. So a concerted and coordinated effort is now underway to catalyze resources from these different partners, including the bilateral partners, development agencies, the private sector, and the Great Green Wall Initiative countries in the Sahel. One important lesson from this initiative is the critical importance of coalition building and partnerships for resource mobilization. At the GEF, we place a particular premium on this aspect and have helped to forge new alliances, increase the economies of scale, crowding private sector, and promote innovative mechanisms for financing environmental outcomes. In closing, let me highlight a few issues that could pave the way for sustainable and resilient future on the African continent, including the priorities for balancing conservation, climate resilience, and economic development in the context of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. First, Africa needs to harness the strength and capabilities of its youthful population. With over 60% of the continent's 1.2 billion people below the age of 25, youth and entrepreneurship can play a vital role in advancing systems transformation. For example, attracting youth to the agriculture and food system sector will ensure widespread application of emerging technologies and innovations for increasing productivity and tackling negative externalities in the food supply chain. This is one way of attracting private sector investment that is so critically needed. The second, the African countries must create enabling policies to foster engagement with the private sector. We know that public finance is critical, but we also know that the demand far exceeds what is available. So the private sector can play a major role in driving innovation, not only through financing, but improving prospects of entrepreneurship across all sectors, including potential for advancing circular economy. For example, while the private sector is gradually internalizing the impacts of climate change in their own business profitability, we need to unlock their ingenuity and financial strength to create radical new solutions that are anchored on a system-wide approach to achieving resilience. Third, African countries need to take advantage of the ever-growing coalitions of public, private, and civil society seeking to advance integrated solutions to the planet's biggest challenges. This is at the core of how we approach our model of financing across the continent. The coalitions offer numerous opportunities for securing knowledge and expertise, innovative financing, and scaling up impactful outcomes. Many businesses are ready to invest in innovations and practices that are transformative, both because it is the right thing to do and because it is a huge opportunity. For example, it has been suggested that achieving sustainable food system globally could generate 80 million jobs and create an additional $2.3 trillion in productive growth by 2030. There's no reason why Africa should be left out of this equation. So as we reflect in the discussions in this panel, I hope that we'll be able to shed light on how the African CSOs will play their part toward resource mobilization and innovative actions that will help us all support the systems transformation that is so much needed across the African continent. I thank you very much for your attention and look forward to the discussion. Over to you, Pauline.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. Thank you for the message. Thank you for the comments that you have made. It has been most of your comments have been, or remarks have been very promising, although you've highlighted the challenge that we have where the demand exceeds the available resources. And you have highlighted the importance of coalitions. And as a coalition that brings together all Africa CSOs, we are looking forward to having more insights, even during the panel discussion, on how we can bring this to fruition. I'll be asking you additional questions, and I'll also be bringing to you questions in the chat. There are some out there that are specifically saying, this is for Mohammed. So we are looking forward to having you later on. But before we ask Mohammed any questions, I would like to present to you the rest of the panelists. Mohammed will continue to be part of the panel, but we will also have a representation from UNEP. We have Levi Kavaji, who is the regional coordinator for ecosystem and biodiversity program in Africa. Levi has over 20 years experience in natural resource management, environmental education, environmental law, and communication. He has also been part of numerous initiatives similar to the kind of things that we do, but also initiatives that are relevant to many of the questions that people have already submitted: integrated water resource management, reducing emissions from forest degradation and deforestation, as well as various other intergovernment panels. You're welcome to the panel, Levi. In addition to Levi, I also have Ronald Kagwa. Ronald Kagwa is going to be sharing experience from a national perspective. Ronald works as the coordinator for the green growth process in Uganda, based at the National Planning Authority. He's an expert in economic policy and planning. He's got more than 20 years experience in sustainable development planning, environmental economics, and natural resource accounting. He's been at the helm of sustainable development planning in Uganda, having worked with the National Environment Management Authority before, and currently with the National Planning Authority. He also participated in discussions that led to the development of the SDGs, as well as the green economy trajectory. So not only will Ronald be discussing from the national processes experience, but also from having participated or having represented the country in the global processes. So I will just give you maybe a few, 1 minute each, Ronald and Levi, to just say hello to the audience, to the seminar. I can see some people are asking me that where are the women? I think that in the next in the next seminar, I will make sure that I am not lonely, that I have some company. Right now, I think I wanted to stand out. I decided to bring these men to the table. Once they show us where the money is, then I can work with the ladies to access the money. So yes, we will start with you, Levi. Say hello to the audience before I begin asking the questions. Levi, I can't see you. Let's have Ronald. Ronald, you can go ahead.
Thank you very much, Pauline. Colleagues, it's great to be on this powerful panel, and I'm looking forward to greater discussions and questions regarding this very important subject to our development, our future. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ronald. Levi, are you there now? Yes, Levi, I can see you. Please go ahead.
Yes, yes. Good afternoon, colleagues and friends. It's a privilege and honor to be here with you today. I look forward to a fruitful engagement. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you very much. I will start straight away with Mohammed. I'll ask you the first question following up on your presentation in which you spoke about all these innovations and opportunities that exist. And you have mentioned the relationship between the CBD and other conventions. And also you have highlighted the fact that there is a lot more demand than the resources that are available, and that we need all hands on deck. And if you could just, borrowing from the lessons learned from, for example, the Climate Change Convention, where they have made significant efforts in bringing on board private sector support, considering that you say that public sector support is not sufficient. Do we have what kind of lessons do you think the Climate Change Convention brings to the Biodiversity Convention that should be utilized to mobilize financing to meet the global targets? And in particular, if you have specific examples of lessons or opportunities that arise from private sector financing.
Thank you very much, Pauline. Well, I think that this is probably going to be a particular area of innovation as we start to look forward to the 2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. From my experience, I think that the private sector is getting increasingly interested in engaging with the global environment community, as we saw from actually from the Paris Agreement, where there was a tremendous momentum and commitments made in tackling the sources of greenhouse gas emissions. I have no doubt that this is the experience that will hopefully lead to a similar type of commitment as we look forward to Kunming. From what we have seen, the private sector obviously is very much concerned about the consequences of especially those drivers associated with biodiversity loss. We have been tackling some of those drivers in the commodity supply chain, which has to do with the major commodities that drive deforestation, especially in the tropics, oil palm, soybean, and beef. And the message that we are getting closely is that we need to have all of these actors around the table so that we all understand what the long-term consequences of these poor decisions are with respect to the natural resources and biodiversity base. So with those coalitions bringing in all of the key actors across the supply chain, from the production to the consumers and everyone in between, including the financial institutions, we can start to have more constructive dialogue about resources that can be channeled effectively to shift the supply chain away from the destructive forces that are happening in those geographies. So that's a lesson that we are beginning to learn, that it actually works when everybody sits around the table, which is why in my talk, I emphasize coalition building. And that includes civil society, because at the end of the day, civil society is out there on the ground with the farmers and the producers, but they're also working closely with the government to change policy equations. So they all need to be around the table together with the private sector. Now is not the time to take independent action. We need to come together around the table. So I'll stop there and see if you have any follow-up.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. I'll just ask one more question before I go to Levi. Because many of these things we have tried. We have tried the coalitions, we have tried doing all these things. Could you just highlight right now, what are the bottlenecks? What are the things that are preventing us from kind of like accessing the money or delivering the money where it matters, or even getting it in the right scale, kind of like matching it to what our priorities are? What are the bottlenecks or the challenges that we need to be aware of so that we are able to access it or to implement some of the recommendations that you're giving us right now?
Yeah, so the message that we are getting from our experience, even with the platforms that we have put in place for the agriculture, the commodities, even with the cities, is that the biggest bottleneck is trust. Trust sounds like a very simple word, but it's deep when you really start to unpack it. For many years, actually many decades, there has been this distrust between the business community, the civil society, and to a certain extent, even the governments, with respect to actually seeing eye to eye on what the right things are that need to be done. So it takes time to build trust. And I think having a neutral entity or neutral broker, such as the GEF, that is trusted by pretty much everybody because of our mandate and our strategic positioning in the policy discourse as well as in the financial space, I think we can start having traction once everybody is willing to put their focus on what is at stake and build that trust together. So civil society, I think, has a lot to do in this front, because we always look at the other constituency with suspicion for good reason. But if you're going to build a coalition, you need to shed some of those suspicions and have a very focused discussion on what the right things are that needs to be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now over to you, Levi. And I'm switching a bit from civil society to now focus on our countries, on our Africa countries. Normally we go into, Levi, you can hear me? I think I can see you.
Yes, I can hear you.
Normally we these processes, these conventions, we are normally committed. But as African countries, we grapple with a lot of challenges. We have a lot of demands on our limited resources. Yet at the same time, we are economies that are dependent on nature. What advice do you have? What examples of guardrails do you think our governments need to put in place to make sure they can come up with people-centered but also nature-positive outcomes? Because as a government, like right now, Uganda, we are in the middle of an election, and we would like our government to come up with things that are supportive of us. But at the same time, they also have a duty to safeguard the environment. So what are some of the guardrails that you think our governments need to put in place to make sure that they come up with people-centered yet nature-positive outcomes? Thank you very much, Levi.
Thank you, Pauline, and thank you for this invitation. it's a honor and a learning process as well. I think the main issue relates to what is now under the terminology of social and environmental safeguards, where it's become increasingly important that development is not divorced of sustainability. And because people are at the center of development and nature underpins life and development, that this form the critical building blocks that must be safeguarded. So the increasing embracing of social and environmental safeguards at various levels is one of the ways that governments, especially African governments, can continue to ensure that development is people-centered and it is not compromising on nature and the ability of nature to support development. And there are quite a few tools now, which some of them have been around for a number of years, such as strategic environmental assessments, which take a broader look at the implications of development projects before they are implemented. It should be done at the planning stage so that it considers all the positives and negative impacts. Try to mitigate the risks that are related to what would be the negative impacts and amplify the positives that would come from projects. Just 1 minute, Pauline, my connection has a problem. Just let me reset a bit.
Just as we wait for Levi to settle, I just want to remind you that you can put your questions and comments in the chat. Compiling them, I will direct them to the appropriate presenter when I have them. I already have a few, and I'm going to integrate them into the questions that I'm having. Levi, are you back now? Are you okay? Okay. Levi, are you here now? I think I'm going to switch a bit to Ronald. Ronald, I believe you're there. And the question I'm going to ask the question I'm going to ask you is related to what Levi was talking about the African countries and the challenges they have in meeting their international obligations. We've seen, for example, as the person in charge of the planning authority, you, for example, know that we have been in the process of setting the NDCs. And so we have committed ourselves to delivering these NDCs, but when push comes to shove, most of us African countries are unable to deliver on our commitments on the NDCs. They're quite ambitious, but also we cannot implement them without external financing. But with respect to the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework targets, what lesson does Uganda, through the green growth process, offer in as far as resource mobilization is concerned? As someone that has been at the helm of national planning in Uganda, what lessons do you think Uganda has to offer to the post-2020 GBF?
Thank you, Pauline, and thank you, colleagues. I'm sorry, my network is very poor, but if I try to understand Pauline's question, what lessons can Uganda offer from the experiences of implementing the Uganda Green Growth Development Strategy that we need to look at here is that Uganda went forward and developed a robust green growth development strategy. Now that strategy has a number of priorities, one of which is protection of natural capital, of which biodiversity constitutes the biggest percentage. So it's therefore critical that you have a strategy of diversity if it is to attract policy attention and resources. Now Uganda has been developing plans, DP1, DP2, and now we are on National Development Plan 3. In all these plans, we have ensured that green growth is mainstreamed in the planning frameworks. So in the same way, we need to mainstream biodiversity concerns in the national planning and budgeting frameworks. So the sector plans and budgets, local government plans and budgets, all of them integrate issues of natural capital. It's also critical to note that we need to optimize budget support as well as off-budget support. In terms of on-budget support, these are the grants, the revenue that we collect, the government of Uganda budget, as well as the donor that support the budgeting process. Now, the Uganda Green Growth Development Strategy is 44%, financed or captured within these development frameworks. So NDP2, NDP3 covers 44% of the financial requirements of this development strategy. Therefore, a key lesson for biodiversity is that we need to optimize the use of public resources, such that the budgeting frameworks, the planning frameworks, cover a substantial portion of the resource requirement. Of course, we need off-budget support from the non-state actors. It is interesting to note that the biggest percentage of Uganda's green growth development strategy is financed by the private sector.
Ronald,
solar
maybe
energy, if you can look at that example.
Maybe if you could switch
there
off
are
the
many
video.
opportunities in solar energy. All right,
Okay.
thank you. So I'm saying that we need to optimize the use of off-budget support, the non-state actors, and we want to note that the biggest percentage of our green growth development strategy is financed by the private sector. If you look at the energy initiative, these are financed by government, especially the so we need to optimize, private support, and we need to invest in biodiversity. So we need to make a business case for biodiversity to make it an attractive area of investment for the private sector.
Ronald, we can't hear you.
It's also important to note use of economic instruments. We need innovation. I'm sorry, my network is poor.
Now
but I'm
you're
saying
fine. Carry on.
That we need to use innovative economic instruments such as fiscal reform, in raising taxes from other areas. We have an environmental levy in Uganda, which taxes, for example, importation of old vehicles is old, equipment is taxed, and that tax is used to implement
Unfortunately, we've lost you, Ronald. Yet you were in the middle of making real proper proposals. Levi, are you back?
Yes, yes, I'm back.
Yes. Yeah. Unfortunately, Unfortunately, we are located in
technology is becoming a big
technologically
challenge.
challenging locations,
Sorry,
but
I have
please.
a challenge with my network.
Yes. Let's Ronald continue.
Okay. Thank you. So therefore, as from a policy perspective, there is the need to craft innovative, economic tools that can, generate resources to finance biodiversity related interventions. It's also important to note that public finance is critical, especially in the short run, to catalyze transition and create an enabling environment for the private sector to invest accordingly. If you look at biodiversity, most of it is not very attractive to the private sector. So there is a need for the public sector to come in, to invest or to create an enabling environment which can enable the private sector to invest in these in the biodiversity sector. If you look at the procurements that are done, these are done by the public sector. And the public sector is the greatest, in terms of procurement. So we need to promote green procurements, and we need to create, markets for, biodiversity, goods and services through these public procurements. Payment for ecosystem services is another critical tool that has been exploited, successfully. Paulina's the ED of EcoTrust. You have used payment for ecosystem services to mobilize substantial resources for biodiversity. My last records indicate that you have at least $4 million US, raised through payment for ecosystem services. That is no mean an achievement, and I want to salute the efforts of EcoTrust in raising this, great financing for biodiversity. I think that it demonstrates the potential of the civil society organizations in raising funds for biodiversity. A key lesson that we learned from the Green Growth Development Strategy is that we need buy-in from the development partners. We have the EU. The European Union was able to inject 100 million euros in our biodiversity, in our green growth initiatives, some of which, support biodiversity initiatives. We have the Global Green Growth, Institute, which is also, supporting efforts. So we need development partner buy-in. We need partnerships to be created at the national level, at the international level, at the local level, if we have to mobilize, resources. And as one colleague indicated, we need to also to tap global financing windows, like the climate funds, the Green Climate Fund. The Global Environmental Facility in Uganda has been critical in supporting, biodiversity initiatives. So therefore, what we need as a country is to position ourselves to tap into these financing windows. Positioning requires preparedness in terms of having bankable biodiversity projects developed, in terms of having feasibility studies done, all of which, can support, biodiversity. We need to create biodiversity funds and trusts. I've already mentioned Eco Trust, which has done very well. I also want to say that in Uganda, we have the Uganda Biodiversity Trust Fund, which mobilizes, manages, and channels funds to biodiversity conservation activities. We have the Rhino Fund and the Ziwa Ranchers. Ziwa Ranchers is a private, initiative which provides land, and that has been able to keep, and develop, rhinos which had become extinct. Now they are back, and there is a baby boom in these rhinos. So these trust funds, who have the environmental fund, which I've mentioned, these are also initiatives which are critical if we are to manage environmental issues. I think, Pauline, I can stop here for the time being. Colleagues, I thank you for listening in. I welcome any questions. Thanks,
Thank
Pauline.
you very much. Thank you very much, Ronald. And I think I'll before I even go back to my questions, I'll slot in a question, because you have mentioned trust funds, and one of the participants had already thrown in a question before they joined about trust funds. And I think it's from Uganda, that how can trust funds get private sector to comprehend the necessity of collaboration with them, which can also benefit the private sector business objectives. So since you have mentioned trust funds, I would like to direct that questions from you, to you. But there's also a question from Victor, which is saying that, can we hear about specific examples in Uganda of privately funded projects, and how are they beneficial to biodiversity? But generally speaking, there are very many people that like your comments, and they can relate with them. And yeah, so before you go, before Levi comes back, maybe if you could just answer those questions, and then we'll go to Levi.
Thank you, Pauline. I think what is critical is that we need to make a business case for biodiversity. Biodiversity creates opportunities for profitability, opportunities for employment. So we need to show that investment in biodiversity is not a waste. It can generate, incomes. I know of many African countries which have national parks which are privately owned. I've seen this in Namibia. I've seen this in Botswana, and even neighboring Kenya has, those initiatives where individuals, have parks. In Uganda, I've got a snake park, which is also privately, owned, and this park, generates, resources for it conserves as well as generates, profits for the proprietors. So what we need is investment in biodiversity sector. Total looks at investment in this as a corporate social of the corporate organization, and this indirectly raises the profitability of such. We have got banks like the development banks, and I'll give an example of the East African Development Bank, which has earmarked resources for biodiversity. So these are critical. I mean, we need to interest these corporate institutions, development banks, like the East African Development Bank, which has created a fund specifically to support biodiversity initiatives. Now, the privately funded projects, I've mentioned some of them, the snake parks, water harvesting initiatives, payment for ecosystem services, where again the private, sector does invest in these. I think these are initiatives that I want to point out as of now. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Levi, back to you now.
Hello.
Thank you, Pauline. I think after Ronald, many of the points may have been mentioned in a different way. So I will just go very quickly on your first question, because I had touched on the need to strengthen strategic environmental assessments. And one of the good examples that we have now is the work that African Development Bank, WWF, and partly by UNEP, phase one of the Futures report, looking at what are the impacts of locating infrastructure, in particular ecosystems, and what will be the impacts of those infrastructure on people and nature in general. But there are also lower tools like environmental impact assessment, social impact assessment that should be put in place, which mainly focus on ensuring that we have ecosystem integrity and the viability of species to promote biodiversity. Promoting human rights, advancing the informed consent concepts, where the prior informed consent is given priority, that communities do not just participate, but they consent to being involved and participating in looking at the social and the environmental impacts of development projects or programs in their areas. Accountability being key, but also looking at the gender aspects. How are the women and men impacted by the development programs? What it takes is that for social and environmental safeguards to be effective, we need standards. And these standards could be encapsulated in global frameworks or conventions, national policies and laws, which leads also to developing robust standards and tools that countries can use at the country level, both at the national level and the subnational level, that we have robust tools and standards that can guide development. When development is taking place, what are the standards? Someone said that if a foreign investor comes to a country and finds that they do not have standards, then they quickly agree that we are going to abide by your standards, because they know there are no standards to abide to in the first place. But if you have standards, then it makes the case that these are our standards, and as you come to invest, we would like you to abide by these standards. But also going with the institutional capacity to ensure that these standards are complied to, and there is enforcement where the standards are not being complied to. And then with the continuous refinement of standards. Standards should not be static, but standards should be like a living document, because every year and every time science is pointing us to new data, new evidence that would make us to reconsider some of the standards that we have put in place before. I will give two specific examples because I was asked for examples, and one or two of them are from the extractives and oil and gas sector. UNEP has developed what we call mapping and assessing the performance of extractive industries, in which case industries pledge to provide information about their processes. This information is audited. The governments are involved in providing information as well. And then the communities have ability to look at what the companies have said they're doing vis-a-vis what they know in reality to be happening. And this is then made available publicly through a website, a portal, and the platform enables information that can be publicly shared to show how the extractive industries are performing where they are working in the fields. And you might find that a company is performing better in one field, but not as well in another field. And this, therefore, is a means, is a tool for self-regulation, but also to enhance public participation and local community engagement in the discussion on the functioning of these companies. The second one under extractives is what we call the tailings standard. This is a standard that UNEP has worked with the private sector as a voluntary standard, which the private sector have signed to in terms of managing the waste that come out of mining processes. This waste, as they are being processed or discharged, there is a standard at which the tailing facilities have to meet. It's a relatively new standard, and it is gaining momentum now. We have a lot of advocacy and outreach to do, but the good thing is that it is a standard to which the private sector has itself committed to ensuring that they do, in order to meet the obligations in their fields and activities, especially from mining and how they handle their waste, the damming of tailings and things like that. And the second group of example is related to implementing, for example, the Nagoya Protocol. And here I would like to mention that the concept of prior informed consent and mutually agreed terms that are discussed between communities that are custodians or guardians of a particular resource and resource users, be they researchers, be they industry, be they public or private sector that are coming to access these particular resources. And in this, the community engages. There are many examples now, and thanks to GEF has funded quite a few of these ABS projects across Africa, where we can demonstrate that indeed Nagoya Protocol is functioning, and it is applicable not just as a policy instrument, but going down to practical economic aspects of life and how the social and environmental safeguards can be protected. We are also currently doing some work in the Okavango Transfrontier, where we bring the different sectors together to discuss how the impacts of wildlife conservation on different sectors, on agriculture, on water resources, on industry, on tourism. The hotel owners come to these meetings, modeling meetings, and we discuss the local community, the local government, the national government. What are the dimensions to wildlife conservation in the Kavango region? This is also a new work that we are doing with an intention to safeguard the social and environmental sustainability of the Kavango region. I will stop there for now because I lost quite a few minutes when I went offline.
Thank you very much, Levi. I'm coming back to you, Mohammed. There are questions that were earlier on submitted by participants. They were meant, some of them were meant for Carlos, but I think that you should be able to respond to them. But there is one still from me, which is about the other effective area-based conservation measures are of great significance to Africa, because many of us live in biodiversity-rich areas that may not necessarily be protected areas, and we participate in their management. However, there is a tendency for our governments to consider them not priority, yet they are part of the functionality of these protected areas. How are financing mechanisms such as GEF going to ensure that financial flows get to where it matters, where we are leaving no one behind, even other areas that may not necessarily be protected areas like the conservancies in Namibia and corridors in Uganda and other parts are able to access some of this financing?
Thanks, Pauline. Actually, in our 30-year history, if we were to take stock of models, it will be pretty obvious that we have tried very hard to allow for diverse experiences across the continent, because we know that countries have different interests and different approaches. You just mentioned the conservancies in Namibia. The GF has been very strongly associated with those, but driven largely by the interests and the commitment of the government itself. But I think the approach that we see as the most appropriate is obviously scaling up conservation to a landscape approach, which basically requires a more comprehensive strategy that puts the protected areas and the most important key biodiversity areas into a broader landscape context. That way you can tackle drivers and hopefully preempt any future risk of expansion into those very fragile ecologies. And I think part of the challenge, again, as we go into these discussions with all the examples that have been highlighted from Uganda and elsewhere, the message that is coming through is clearly we need to start thinking about breaking silos, because we have civil society in many of these spaces that are civil society working on tackling waste management and environmental degradation. There are those focused on protected areas and community-based conservation. We have to find a way to speak to a common agenda that actually looks to integrate all these priorities, because at the end of the day, this is how we're going to achieve systems transformation. And we can't keep working in a very piecemeal fashion. Many of these examples can only lead to transformation if we start to link them and connect them and look at the issue of economies of scale very strategically. You know, we were talking earlier about trust fund, but if you look at other types of funds, the water funds, for example, in Kenya, we've been working with the government of Kenya and TNC and IFAD to develop a water fund that will actually start to transform land use in large river basins such as the Tana River and ultimately lead to reducing degradation downstream to benefit everybody in the water basin. So there are different models, but I think this piecemeal approach is what we need to move away from to take a more transformative approach at landscape scale. Back to you, Pauline.
Mohammed, before you leave, there was one earlier rather cheeky question from a friend of mine, Bill from Uganda, where he had directed it to Carlos. Given the extraordinary success that Costa Rica has had with protecting its environment with funds saved from not having an army and an income generated from its acclaimed green tourism industry, a Ugandan study team came back with the message: why can't Uganda be a Costa Rica of Africa? Can Costa Ricans, brackets TICO, come over to Africa to share their knowledge?
Yeah, that's the kind of question that my CEO would have loved to take on, because he's very passionate about tackling these, having worked in both civil society and government. He's got tremendous experience and can have a very, very direct answer. But I think just speaking from our partnership as GF with Costa Rica over the years, one of the things that we've learned is that the government takes a whole of a country approach. and in their strategies, and so they don't have any issue of sectoral fragmentation. For example, as Minister of Environment is also the minister in charge of energy and water resources. So there's no risk of trade-offs, where you try and invest in energy at the expense of protecting the natural environment. So as a result of this, the government is able to take a holistic and system approach to its agenda, which is really what explains why the country has had such tremendous success. And now, so I'll ask the Ugandans to reflect, is the current environment from a government institutional framework really comparable to what Costa Rica has done in terms of how its institutional framework is organized to be able to deliver this systems level change across the country. So that's all I can say, and too bad we couldn't get the CEO himself, but hopefully you get another opportunity in a future webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Back to you, Levi. Levi, I think there's been quite a bit of talk about mobilizing resources from elsewhere, from private sector, from CSOs and so on and so forth. And there is some talk about voluntary commitments, borrowing from the climate change movement. What's your take on these voluntary commitments? And do you think they could complement the outcomes of the new GBF? And how do you think such voluntary outcomes could be or should be funded, or voluntary commitments? Because we are thinking of also committing as civil society. So yes.
Thank you, Pauline. It's a very pertinent question. I think the bottom line is who benefits from nature? I think nature is for all of us. And when we understand it this way, then there would be no dichotomy between state actors and non-state actors. State actors have a certain responsibility which they must fulfill, because they have the social contract with the governments, have social contracts with the constituents, and they can just do so to a certain extent. But when you have your half acre or 1 acre or 20 acre land, what you do on that land is largely your responsibility at a very individual level. Where I'm starting, it's basically the responsibility and the decision of the owner, the landowner, or whoever has rights to that land, to develop it. How do you develop it? And the landscape is made of such 1 acre, 20 acres, 50 acres, 1,000 acres, 1 million hectares, and so forth. So collectively, looking at a landscape, it means that what can be done, especially on public lands, could be the responsibility of the state actor mainly, but also the non-state actor could be given an opportunity on public lands to contribute to the commitments that the government or the states have made. And remember, even as we talk about GBF, the GBF is going to be written by people. And these people have networks, they have touch with civil society, they have touch with private sector, they have touch with faith-based organizations. And their thinking is going to be influenced to a certain extent by the thinking that goes on in these communities of practices and interest groups and such groups. So for me, the commitments need to be made by everyone. It would then be better if the commitments are made up to the individual level. What can I, Levis Kavagi, do to contribute to, if there is a 30-30 as it is now, the discussion is going, but if whatever we come up as, let's say, conservation area targets, What can I do to contribute to that? And how can I do it? Can I express it in a commitment? How can that commitment be captured? So the question also is, how do we capture these commitments? So the answer is yes, we need all commitments. We need the non-state actors to make commitments. We need them to deliver on those commitments. So we need a mechanism that would enable the non-state actors to capture the commitments made by the non-state actors, a mechanism where the commitments can be tracked, and apart from being tracked, how they can be aggregated and contribute to what the country as a nation has committed to deliver on. So these mechanisms need to be put in place.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we are running out of time. Much as we were still interested in listening from you, we are running out of time, and I need to leave time for Zeneb, the only other lady that I am with on the panel, to make the closing remarks. And before Zeneb makes the remarks, I would like to share what I have picked in summary from the comments, the discussions, and the presentations. I've picked from three main areas: private sector engagement, and then the CSO coalition and alliances, and then a message to the governments. For private sector, the key message is that we need to make a business case to make biodiversity an attractive area of investment through many different opportunities as proposed. And then for the CSO, it's very clear that demand exceeds supply. We need to innovate, and we need to come up with ways that will break the silos, enable us to acquire economies of scale, put together units of practice for us to be able to access the different mechanisms as they come up. To the governments in Africa, the key message that is coming out here is that a conservation economy is one that looks at nature as a solution, where nature is at the center of the development processes, where we have opportunities that can be scaled to indeed transform economies to benefit people, come up with standards, and there is caution to the government that we should not be looking at the private sector because the profit-making imperative should never be at the center of the new economic system. They gave examples of extractives and other industries. They do make contributions, but mainly to clean up or to make people happy after they have done a lot of damage to the environment. And also there was a call to the state actors to become true servants of the people, something that is called political will. At this point, to invite Zeneb, as I mentioned earlier on, this is an event that was organized jointly between the Africa CSO Biodiversity Alliance and the Africa Development Bank. I would like to invite Zeneb from Africa Development Bank to make the closing remarks. Zeneb, you're muted. You're muted, Zeneb.
I'm muted, okay, sorry, dear. Thank you, dear moderator, dear civil society representative, dear colleagues, participants. On behalf of the African Development Bank, I wish to thank you for taking part of this webinar today. I'm glad we managed to have this fruitful discussion. Glad that in such discussion, the identification of innovative ways of scaling up financing for biodiversity will include civil society actors alongside other actors, public sector, private sector. The involvement of civil society organization in the post-2020 Convention on Biological Diversity Framework is more than necessary. And civil society is one of the most relevant actors if not the most, to take action on the financing for nature-based solutions on our continent. Communities are the ones directly affected by the negative impact on nature. The needs, the concern, and priorities of these communities can best be reflected by civil society organizations. Dear colleagues and participants, today we have exchanged, we have identified best practices and lessons on the mobilization of domestic and international financing for nature-based solutions. We have discussed the ways to better engage civil society organizations in this exciting journey towards the development of a post-2020 global diversity framework. We have agreed to continue fostering our joint engagement to mobilize effective resources for building resilience communities and build back a better Africa. The conversation must go on beyond this meeting. This is the beginning. But most of all, we international organizations, civil society actors, government, private sector are committed to meeting concrete objectives. We are committed to ensure sustainable use of nature on our continent for the well-being of population. Together, hand in hand, we can and we must mobilize adequate resources. Together, we must identify ways to obtain financial support to conduct our impactful and transformative action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Zeynep. Before we close, I also had one of my colleagues, Khalid, who was taking minutes. Khalid, do you have additional comments to the ones that I mentioned?
Hey, Pauline. Nice to hear your voice. Nothing too crazy, nothing too major. I've just been trying to make an absolute difference between the new Development Bank and African Development Bank, because in the civil society circles, there is a great deal of vilification of the new Development Bank that's under BRICS for promoting agendas, which whilst they are beneficial economically, actually are seen as acceleration of resource abstraction, which ultimately will cause more harm. I think my last closing comments for the African Development Bank is, please ensure that your modus operandi is not based on one of exploitation, and we have to move towards a post-scarcity society. So the only way of achieving that is stopping exploitation. If we mirror the practices of the New Development Bank, the China Development Bank, the World Bank, all of these neoliberal institutions, then we are cementing the fate of Africa. It's the final frontier in terms of galvanizing, harnessing, operationalizing the minerals of this continent. And I just want to say, stop with the agenda. Stop with the looking at commodification agenda. People have value for existing on the earth for themselves. And if they are allowed to engage with their natural environment, capacitated and respected and with dignity, they will be able to look after it. But when we transform that kind of narrative into one of making the conservation part of a corporate interest, making conservation part of commodification, then we open up this avenue where people with power, with capital, can dictate how conservation happens, who's supposed to benefit from it, and obviously that leads to the deridement of Africans in Africa. So thank you so much for the opportunity to add these last final comments, and I think I've said what I wanted to in my questions at the time. Thank you, guys.
Okay. Thank you very much. A big thank you for everybody. Thank you for allowing to be hosted by me. Thank you, Zeynep, Mohammed, Levi, Ronald, Jamvan, and everybody that has worked around the clock to put this together. We have gotten a lot of information from this, And also we would like to let you know that these engagements will continue. This is just the beginning of a series of seminars that we'll be having in conservation financing, but also in a host of other areas as we have identified to be useful to biodiversity conservation in Africa. So we've come to the end of the dialogue. I think it's been a great dialogue, and we still have spare to enjoy 6 minutes as some of us are able to find our ways home. Thank you very much, everybody. It's been nice seeing you. We had about 150 people registering, but we kept oscillating between 75 and 85. I think people kept dropping off and coming back. It's been a pleasure hosting you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pauline. Great job.
Thanks, Pauline. Bye.
Thanks, Pauline. Thanks, Mohammed. Thank you very much.
Hey, Yemi.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Pauline.
Well done,
Bye-bye.
Pauline. Bye.